Keep Your Hands Off Eizouken makes no attempt to hide protagonist Asakusa's inspiration by Miyazaki, whose blood runs through the show's veins. The series which inspires her, leading to her realization as a child that the labor of individual humans lies behind the media that she enjoys, is Future Boy Conan, Miyazaki's only full-length TV anime. While highly influential and widely beloved, Miyazaki is rarely the principal target of fandom in most anime depictions of otaku, perhaps as a result of his works' detachment from the otaku-oriented media which makes up so much of the industry, and his active distaste for the consumers of those products. Nevertheless, his lineage appears here, and Conan is hardly the sole instance where that's obvious. A passing familiarity with how Miyazaki draws his manga and design sheets makes it clear where Asakusa's biggest influences lie. Take a look at this image from a Future Boy Conan art book that I really wish was scanned. It's drawn as if painted in watercolors, and it may well be, though I don't know enough about painting to say, with clear white space left in the corner of objects as a means to indicate shading. Lines remain sketchy and incomplete, conveying a sense that the image is subject to change, but still fairly developed. This isn't quite equivalent to a book of pure designs, as it's closer to a storyboard or layout, but it's close enough for comparison's sake. When you turn to some of Asakusa's concept art in the first episode, these elements are just as present. The watercolor effects are even clearer here, with the white space and uneven lines remaining from Miyazaki's pages. Admittedly, some of this is a result of preliminary work inherently lending itself to art that's not fully colored in. But just look at this shot from episode 1. Omnipresent wind power in a floating city should be an obvious nod to Miyazaki, and if you don't recognize that, then go watch my video on the man. If the style of her drawings was the only hint, I'd have to concede that I was making a leap here. But the explicit reference to Conan, combined with both formal and stylistic similarities to Miyazaki's design work, makes it clear. Asakusa is a hardcore Miyazaki otaku, and the show shares that spirit of hers. Alright, you might say, that'll be interesting information when I play the next edition of Anime Trivial Pursuit, but did I really need a whole video on it? No, but frankly, no one would click on a video about how Eizouken channels the spirit of classic otaku, because that's what it does, and that's what this video actually is. The title isn't a lie, of course. As demonstrated, Asakusa really does borrow a ton of her aesthetic vision from Miyazaki's, and that vision runs through the whole show, especially in its fantastical scenes. But Miyazaki is just the tip of the iceberg. Eizouken, as a whole, is remarkably retro in its proclivities and influences, despite being a 2020 anime made at least partially in Flash. Before we permanently leave Miyazaki, though, it's worth recalling the fact that the man was a big inspiration to the first generation of otaku, in a way he simply isn't in the same way nowadays. Most new animators have seen his work to this day, but Hideaki Anno and his cohort actually had the chance to work with the man, at a time where he was putting out far more material than he is now. At that point, his ideas were showing up on both the silver and small screens, and his work represented a break from the stifling culture exemplified by Toei. It was a time where anime was still young, and aimed at those even younger than it, before otaku culture had a chance to cloister around a relatively narrow set of aesthetic priorities. Any serious otaku of the time was into Miyazaki, his girls like Clarice, but also the fantastic worlds he dreamed up. With that behind us though, let's return to the design sheets and the fantastic sequences they inspire for some more examples of this supposedly long-lost otaku spirit. While anime has hardly stopped portraying fantastic worlds across its existence, the focus on mechanical design has certainly taken a hit, as is specifically alluded to in episode 5. In one of the notebook pages that Mizusaki pores over in episode 1, however, almost all of Asakusa's designs are of machines of one sort or another. The show recognizes that this isn't a common route to take nowadays too. Mizusaki mentions that while she's met other young animators, Asakusa is the first person she's met who wants to design for animation. And while this has probably always been the case to some extent, the relative decline of mecha and original forms of fantasy in relation to Tolkien-esque worlds has likely only furthered this process. The reaction to works where a focus is put on setting design shows how important it is, though. Somali and the Forest Spirit, Toilet-Bound Hanako-kun, and Dorehedoro are all shows from this season doing well largely on that basis. Yet even these series, barring Dorehedoro if you're being quite generous, show little in the way of intricate machines, something notoriously hard to draw yet once omnipresent across much of anime. Someone like Asakusa really would be quite a rare find nowadays, even though her designs extend beyond the mechanical. She's hardly the only example here, of course. In episode 1, Mizusaki rushes home to see an anime by the dream team of Toshiyuki Inoue, Shinya Ohira, and Mitsuo Iso, all famous animators who made their names in the last century, working on the kinds of projects that someone like Asakusa would have done concept design for. Of course, all three of them remain popular in Sakuga circles today, but those very circles are in many ways a holdover of classical otaku behavior, when individual cuts were identified and copied long before Sakuga Boru existed. While it would certainly be a leap to claim that Mizusaki's love of intricate character animation is a new thing, KyoAni wasn't making their own works until the 2000s after all. The focus on bringing that about in combat-oriented sequences is certainly a niche today, if a beloved one. She's hardly as backwards-facing as Asakusa, but I'm willing to bet she's watched Akira on loop many times. The foremost example of this whole trend, though, at least in my view, is episode 5, the one about the giant robots. There's a ton of classic otaku elements here that even the newest fan would pick up on. The most obvious is the Mecha Research Club, which A, is a Mecha Research Club, rare enough given that Mecha isn't doing so hot right now, and B, apparently goes back to the 1800s, and for that reason takes inspiration from classic robot concepts that emerged outside Japan. It's not that anime and manga never pull from films, novels, and other non-anime sources, but we can all admit that it's a fairly incestuous industry, and that's especially true for stuff about otaku. Oreimo doesn't detail how 19th century French novels played an overwhelming role in the trajectory of sister fucking games is what I'm saying. But the Mecha Club does, because that's what early otaku did, though admittedly, in specific corners, this still occurs today. At a time where anime were still fewer in number, Japanese nerds just couldn't exclusively consume material coming from their own country, and especially not one medium. It was a time where anime, tokusatsu, and foreign sci-fi were all equally important to fans. It's not hard to imagine even here in the West, as early sci-fi conventions were often a prime meeting spot for the very young anime fandom. Still though, who cares? What does it matter that Eizouken's showcasing a classic otaku spirit, unless you're already some sort of otaku supremacist in the first place? Well, I think it reveals a few interesting things about the route otaku culture has taken over the years. First, we've got to remember that the incredibly hardcore otaku of the 80s did not die out. Rather, their spirit persists today, as this series shows. To some extent, of course, the story I've been telling of old school otakudom here has been dressed up. It had problems we don't have to deal with, even if they were watching cooler movies than most anime fans I know. But having reached a point where the term is commonly used among young Japanese people, and where an anime fandom of some sort is normative even outside the island nation, hasn't made obsessive interest in niche series any more popular. The number of incredibly hardcore otaku who are intensely concerned with the production of their series and the history behind that production has probably increased, but it's a smaller proportion of those who consider themselves otaku as a whole. And it's honestly difficult to separate that renewal from a resurgence in attention towards labor worldwide. I don't think we can separate this spirit of Eizouken's from the fact that it's a great show. It's the creators who borrow from outside anime and manga, who recognize that mecha has a history that dates back further than Tetsujin 28, that make the best anime. Naoko Yamada, Kunihiko Ikuhara, Hideaki Anno, Mamoru Oshii, Osamu Dezaki, and Tsutomu Mizushima. All of these directors pull from other film, from theater, from novels, from philosophy, and from the rest of the world in which we live. Eizouken does the same thing as a result of its own influences within anime and manga, and because of it carries an aesthetic philosophy which allows it to surpass the good series we get all the time and to attain greatness. More shows need to follow his lead. Sorry for the fact that it's been a while. The Miyazaki video's month-long editing session really burnt me out a bit, but I am back. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks, as always, to the patrons who continue to stick around, especially my $10 patrons. Alice, Amber, Annalisa Koenig, Arentios, Blanc, DJ Jax, Ilaria Lowy, Godfish, John Clark, Jolene Munson, Melody Heron Anderson, Not Sam, Petra, Pajama God, Shadowfish, Thomas Pitkin, Vey, and War Dog E. Next video should be a little more theory focused, though it could also not end up being the next video, since this one wasn't intended to come out until a couple weeks ago. Anyways, As always, you can support me on Patreon or find me in the links listed below, and I will see you next time. Bye!